we'll get started. Small class today. I know some people emailed me saying they were sick, which, yeah, that tracks. There seems to be some kind of flu going around. But we'll make do with that. That's what the recording is for. If there are less people next week, though, then we're going to start to have perhaps a bit of a problem. But did we all read or start to read Lovecraft for today? Yeah? How many of you actually finished it? Okay, so a few of you. And how many of you did like half? Yeah? Okay, so good. I expected that like most of you would not finish, which is totally fine. So most of the examples that I pulled from for today are going to be from the first half of the text, okay? With in mind that most people weren't going to read necessarily all of it. The first thing I do want to start off, though, as a kind of introductory statement, is to come back to what we said last week, right? Because as I've been alluding to in the first few classes that we did, a lot of the literature that we're going to be working on in this semester, including Lovecraft, which I'm sure you've already seen, even if you've only read half of it, is that it's very often a literature that is aware of its own references and aware of its own ability to pull from the past, right? That's one of the major reasons why I talked about Poe, Gilman, and the Romantics a little bit last week. And of course, we're going to be talking a little bit about that in reference to Lovecraft this week, but especially next week when we talk about the actual language of Lovecraft. Although I'm sure it's going to come up this week. But something that I thought was very interesting, and that's in part my fault, like part of the ways that I organize my lectures is to go off of what interested you or what seemed to engage the students. But one of the things that I felt that we didn't necessarily touch on enough last week was the idea of madness, right? Especially in Gilman, right? One of the things that's so central to the text is that, at least the way that we talked about it, is that the narrator kind of goes insane, right, at the end. And we just kind of took that as fact, right? But I'm sure if some of you have read any supplementary material about Gilman, or even thought about the text a little bit more, right, the notion itself of madness is a bit of a slippery one in the context of the text. Why might that be, right? Why would I say, I'm genuinely asking you the question, right? If you remember Gilman's text from last week, which you should, it's only a week ago, right? Why would madness not be as clear-cut of a thing as we might expect in that text? Is it clear-cut? Or do you find it clear-cut, actually? Might be a better way of seeing it. Yeah, Francesca.
I feel like if you read into the text, you understand that she's not totally there by the end of it.
She's not
Maybe
totally
at the beginning, you're like, okay, yeah, she's a reliable narrator and all that. But then towards the end, that's when more of just the middle before.
So you would say, you would fall more on the side that she is insane by the end. Right, okay. It's interesting because a lot of, and this is not going to be a class on Gilman, right? I'm using this, again, just as introductory material for other stuff, including Lovecraft. But there are a few readings of Gilman that I think are notable to highlight that kind of make the opposite claim, right? That you're making, Francesca, or that I was alluding to before, wherein at first, because she was the narrator, was so restricted by society, right? It wasn't necessarily the narrator's true self, right? That was at play, right? Or evidenced. Whereas what we may call madness was in fact this character's real self that was kind of emerging in light of the ghosts of women past, right? That were also constrained, okay? Now, the point of raising this is not necessarily to have a huge debate about it, right? I'm sure you can reread the text if you want to go into more depth into that. Technically, it could also be an essay topic if you really want to go for it at the end of the semester. That's just laying it out there, right? There's nothing stopping you from approaching that topic. But what I feel is very interesting going forward, starting with Lovecraft and a few of the other texts that we're going to be talking about, not all of them, but this notion of what constitutes a normal state, right, is very much at play in a lot of the literature that we're going to be covering, okay? What is the regular way of life, okay? And this is not me like throwing some kind of hodgepodge baton around saying like, oh, there's no such thing as normal things anymore, or no such thing as truth anymore. That's not the idea, right? I think a lot of the authors that we're going to be reading would say that there are certain things that we can agree upon, right? And so on and so forth. That's not necessarily what we're getting at here. What we're getting at is rather a questioning of what forms the foundations of the world around us, right? And anything that might go outside of those foundations, can that be considered utterly mad or utterly insane? Okay? So that's something that I think that we can start to think about when thinking about Lovecraft. Okay? We're going to come back to Lovecraft a little bit later, right, in today's class as an author and as a writer. But of course, because last week we spent most of our time on the 19th century, I do want to actually start us off proper as with the, as is befitting of the actual nature of this class, with the 20th century. And this might seem like an odd question to ask, but I think it does have some relevance. When does the 20th century begin? Because I think there's more than one answer to this. There's the mathematical answer, and there's the social answer. So, again, I'm launching the question to you all. When does the 20th century begin? You can answer either mathematically or socially. Yeah. Yeah.
Like a date?
Yeah, like a date. Sorry. Or temporally, I should say. Yes, sorry. Not mathematically. Yeah. 20th century. When does that begin? Yeah, technically in 1901, right? That's when the 20th century officially begins, right? Often we assume 1900 or 2000, right, is the beginning of the next century, but officially it's the first year of that century, right? So 1901 would be technically the first year of the 20th century, right? Liam, did you have your hand up? No? Okay, cool. But when would we say socially the 20th century begins? Is it different? Think about what we were talking about last week, right? In 1900, is the world, or 1901, is the world that different from the world that we were describing last week? The world of Gilman, Poe, the Romantics. In some ways it is. In other ways, not so much, right? But there is at some point a real radical shift in the way that society organizes and thinks about itself. And this actually matters to the class today. It happens in the early 20th century, the temporal 20th century. When would that be, Francesca? Yeah, when does World War I start? Yeah, 1914. Good. Pop quiz. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so 1914. Has anyone actually seen the TV show Downton Abbey here? One person. Yeah, Liam, you also saw it? How do you find it? Like, either of you? Yeah, you like it? Awesome. Yeah, whatever, however you want to call it. Yeah, proletarian type of stuff. But yeah, absolutely. What do you think of it, Liam? You like it? Just yeah? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So when does that show start? Like season 1, what happens in literally the first episode, right? There is like a major event, but also, yeah, it is not officially at the start. It's been a while. I'm sure both of you have listened to it. Do you remember, Frances? Do you remember, Lee? So the show starts, and the first episode is the sinking of the Titanic, right? In 1912, right? So just a little bit before World War I, right? But what you were bringing up, both of you, is very interesting in the sense that what we see, right, in the beginning of the 1900s, right, is what we generally in history call the Edwardian, right? The successor to Queen Victoria, who ruled for ever and a half, right? So Queen Vicky dies in 1901, I think. So right at this end of the 19th century, she croaks, and her son takes over, Edward, right? Edward doesn't stay very long. He stays for about like 10 years or so, and dies in 1911, right as, right, the Titanic is going to sink, right as World War I is about to kick off, right? But what changes in society with World War I, right? Like, what are some of the fundamental shifts? Why would we make that a more social distinction between the Victorian, Edwardian era that is more conservative and upheld versus, yes, so industry kicks off a lot more, absolutely. What else, right? The war itself, think of the war itself, right? If you've read any war novels, maybe you took war war and literature classes. I think Jesse McEachran gave it not that long ago. If you took that class, you might have an idea. Or even if you've watched a World War I movie, there's a few that came out not that long ago. They weren't particularly good, but they came out. They do get at that. Yeah, Francesca.
Or in poetry class, there's a lot of focus in the writing on the trauma.
Yeah.
Going to war.
Not good, but yes, yeah, absolutely. So trauma, right, absolutely is a huge one. But think about it, right? Again, you might say, well, of course, war has always been a traumatic thing, right? But in line with what you were saying, Liam, about industry, right? What happens in World War I that did not happen in the other wars is the absolute integration of industry and war. Right? Think of the major war that happened just before that, which would have been something like the Boer War, which happened in South Africa, right? And also involved the British. Starting to see a pattern of the 19th and 20th century where the British are involved in a lot of shady things. And so what you see, right, in the Boer War is still an old style of war. You see a little bit of indications of what's to come, but you don't see the level of militarization and industry that you do see in the First World War, right? And that has a profound impact on people, right? Where just a few years prior, right, prior to 1914, if you went to war, you would have had barely automatic weapons, right? You wouldn't even have planes, really, in the war. You wouldn't have had gas, right? Or all of those other things. It's a profoundly radical shift in the way that we decide to, well, in this case, murder people, right? And I'm not saying this to start off the class in like a really depressing way, right? That's not what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to do is exemplify this radical break, right? So everything that we were talking about before in the 19th century still maintains, right? The rapid industrialization of the world, the expanse of people's awareness of their positions in society and wanting to change that, right? But the war really offers an opportunity for people to express it in really concrete terms, right? Saying, hey, for example, who are the people who actually go to war, right? Somehow, it always ends up not being the lord of the manor, right? Somehow it always ends up being to take the Downton Abbey example, right? It always ends up to be the cooks, right? Or the servants, right? Lord whatever the fuck in Downton Abbey, Crawley, that's his name. Lord Crawley, right, doesn't fight, right? Barrow does, or any of the others that are in the servants' hall, right? So suddenly we get this awareness, right? And they're the ones who are traumatized. They're the ones who come back with scars on their face or who can't walk properly anymore, right? And what this does is cause people to really give an example of why they should change society and the world around them, right? Whether we agree or not with the ways that people try to actually change society, right, is another issue entirely, right? We can get into that if we really want to. Lovecraft, for example, had his own ideas about that. If you've read the introduction to At the Mountains of Madness in the edition, did anyone actually read that, the China Miéville introduction? China Miéville just keeps popping up in this class, and it really wasn't intended that way, but no, okay, none of you read that introduction. It's fine. But he does kind of bring up Lovecraft's political stances about these things, and they're explicitly related to the traumas of modernity, right? In really horrifying ways, by the way. I'm sure some of you are very aware of Lovecraft's positions on things. We might touch upon it a little bit later. They're not ones that I would personally condone, right? But, if we wanted to take another example, the one that happened in Russia, right? In 1917, what happened in Russia? Yeah, Liam. A civil war that led to? Yeah, exactly, the fall of the Tsar. So the institution of what became known as the Soviet Union, right? Wasn't called that at the time, would get that name a little bit later, but yeah. So, again, a great example of things that went awry in various ways, but also an example of people taking matters into their own hands because they were starting to become dissatisfied with the old world order, right? And trying to institute a radically new vision of society. Okay? So there's all kinds of historical debates as to when exactly the 20th century began, right? Some people, in fact, place it during Queen Victoria's time, right? So a little bit before the temporal 20th century begins. For our purposes here in this classroom, I think that it's useful to start it with the war, just because it's the one that most people kind of agree upon, and because it's not a history class, so we're not necessarily here to debate the merits of these different ideas. Okay? But let's bring it back to literature for a bit. Did anyone read the nonfiction article that I put on Studium, M.R. James and the Quantum Vampire? I did mention in the message last week that it was a complicated text, right? Carlos, you were nodding your head. Did you read it? Okay. Yeah, good. I assigned it, and then I realized that I don't think I was going to be able to talk about it as much as I necessarily wanted to, just because this is not going to be a class on M.R. James himself. But Mieville brings up an interesting point in that article about when weird fiction begins. Do you remember what he... No, it has something to do with what we talked about all the way back in week 1, right? About an octopus. You don't remember it. He says something about tentacles. It's fine if you don't remember. I'm just trying to jog your memory here. Okay, so the reason why I mentioned this article, and then I'm bringing it up here, is that for this article and for the claims of it, the 20th century and this genre that we're developing throughout this class of weird fiction begins, right, this very 20th century genre of weird fiction begins, and I'll quote here from the article, it begins with the spread of the tentacle, which is why I brought it up in class 1. A limb type with no Gothic or traditional precedents, in Western aesthetics at least. From a situation of near total absence in Euro-American era to culture up the 19th century. To one of being the default monstrous appendage of today, signals the epochal shift to a weird culture. Right? So I didn't paste that correctly, and so it came out weird. But I think you got the gist of what the article is saying here. Right? Even in a literary sense, there seems to be a kind of break, at least where the author is concerned here, of saying before there was no sign of this type of image. Right? And the image here being the octopus or the tentacle, right? Which we spent a few minutes on in the first class, saying how bizarre and misshapen the tentacle was, right? And how it caused a kind of level of anxiety in us that we didn't know quite how to describe, right? To suddenly, in the 20th century, in what the author calls a weird culture, not just a weird fiction, but a weird culture, right? So much larger than just fiction, to it being rather pervasive, right? And we can think of this beyond just the example of tentacular beings in Lovecraft, for example, and into other images. The movie that I pulled the image from in week 1 is a really good example. That movie came out in 1920 something, right? So right at the beginning of the 20th century. Some of you might have seen images, right? Cartoon images. To bring it back to the Russian Revolution, right? What's the classic image of capitalism in cartoons, especially in the early 20th century? Hint, it has to do with what we just read, a tentacle monster, right? Often you'll see in these early cartoons, right, literally a Monopoly Man-like figure, right? A dude with a monocle and a top hat with a kind of tentacular body, right? And it's an image that was also used with imperialism, for example, or to criticize imperialism, of it being this monstrous, disgusting creature that can literally go anywhere, right? And affect everything that it touches with its suction cups, bringing it into its core body, which is the Monopoly Man's head, right? Or whatever. Does this image make sense to people so far? Am I just blathering on like a madman? You can say it doesn't make sense, and I'll try to elaborate it on a little bit more, right? Does anyone need further elaboration on this? No? Okay, good. So the tentacle, right? Keep thinking of it. It doesn't show up explicitly in Lovecraft, or at least in the text that we're reading for today. It appears a little bit on some level, in the sense that we're talking about appendages, right? Things that shouldn't exist in the Lovecraftian sense. Okay. Okay. Now, what I wanted to do right now, what time is it? Oh, it's already been 20 minutes. It's not so bad. Why can I not exit? There we go. Lovecraft himself would actually write a really interesting short story. Some people call it prose poem, but no, that's just weird. Called Nyarlathotep. Let's just go with that. The only reason I'm bringing up this short story is because I think the opening passage is a really good summary of this sense that I'm getting at, right? Without necessarily the fluff of talking about the war or anything like that, right? I think Lovecraft, for all his faults, namely being a brutal racist, for all his faults, had a really good sense of the time, right? Knowing how to describe it in a really disturbing kind of way that gets at what a lot of people were feeling, right? And I think the opening to this short story really gets to it. Does anyone want to read it, or do you want me to? I should never suggest that I do it, because then people are immediately going to say yes. Okay, I'll read it. The crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. And here it starts. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing. Such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces, and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demoniac alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. Let's deconstruct this paragraph. What about it screams what we've just been talking about the beginning of the 20th century? There's a few aspects here that I would highlight.
It could be related to the war.
Okay.
Something that's unexpected and it affected everyone. And maybe because the reason he couldn't go to war, so maybe he's like alone.
You don't know if Lovecraft participated in the war, but at least the narrator seems to. Yeah, so good. So absolutely, the war kind of signals the shift to a season of political and social upheaval. Right. Good. What else? What else might we highlight here? Yeah, Francesca. Mm-hmm. Good. When we hear, yeah, good. Absolutely, the Gothic, right? The Gothic with demoniac alteration, right? Absolutely, these monsters and ghosts that seem to appear. Go ahead.
Higher power, and a lot of us were.
Okay, good.
It gives it like an otherworldly feeling.
Right, and right in the paragraph or the section that you highlighted, prophecies, warning and prophecies. What do we think of when we hear the word prophecy? Is it a secular word that doesn't imply any other higher power? Usually when we imagine prophecy, right, we imagine some kind of extra power, right? And even, this might be a reference for, that kind of goes over your generation's head, but does anyone know who Warren Buffett is? One of the richest men to ever walk the face of the earth. But people called him the Oracle, right? Because he seemed to have a sense of what to invest in at certain points, right? But it's a profoundly, literally material idea, right? Investing money somewhere. But even in the 20th and 21st century, when people were talking about him, they ascribed to Buffett this kind of mystical power, right? Of being able to just know about the sense of the world, right? We can kind of unpack that and all of that, but we won't, because this is not a class about Warren Buffett. But right, this idea of prophecies is really interesting as well, right? And it's interesting to consider in relation to what we were talking about last week with the slow demise of religion, right? And Christianity especially, but not exclusively, right? Usual monotheistic religions that a lot of people believed in at the time, right? There's this kind of demise that's happening. And yet people, like we mentioned last week, still want this sense of otherworldliness, right? The universe had passed from the control of known gods to that of gods which were unknown. Again, pointing to that shift. There's one last thing that I want to highlight. Maybe you'll figure it out. It's more towards the end, actually in the last sentence. It's a long last sentence, but in the last sentence, there's something that I think is really interesting that we haven't brought up yet in this class at all. And that really is a signal shift for the 20th century. I would say it's in the first 8 words of the last sentence before the hyphen. Yeah.
Is it the word demoniac?
No, after the word demoniac. Literally, what's the word before the hyphen? Right before the hyphen. Seasons. Good. Alteration in the sequence of the seasons. What do we get from that? What's he saying? Literally paraphrase, right? What is an alteration in the sequence of seasons? What is he saying here? What is happening? Yeah.
Like the climate? I can't find the words.
Climate, someone help her? Change.
Thank you.
Right? Climate change. Literally, that's what he's pointing to in this case. He wouldn't have put it or thought of it in those terms, right, necessarily, because this was written at the beginning of the 20th century. And while there was some awareness that was starting to emerge in thinkers that said, well, we maybe can't continue on to just ruthlessly exploit the planet like we are currently doing with the rise of factories and industries and so on. This was few and far between in the 19th and 20th century. But it is something that is very interesting that Lovecraft is bringing up in this paragraph. This awareness that along with these strange shifts in literal society, there is also an alteration in the climate, right? Fall is happening in winter, summer and spring, so on, right? You just kind of alteration of the seasons. They're all out of whack, right? The idea that we're getting snow only in January now is kind of wild, right? At least in Canada here, right? I'm speaking. Whereas some of you are probably, again, too young to remember this, but when I was young enough to go Halloweening, right, trick-or-treating, there was sometimes snow, right, in October. I'm not that old, by the way, so it wasn't that long ago. But still, right, it does, like, this idea of signal shifts and alterations in the seasons is something that has been with us for some time, at least for all of our lives, right? And that already Lovecraft is kind of pointing towards. The last literary example that I'm going to give before we get into more of like the theoretical aspects of today's class, which I've already delayed for too long. Has anyone here read the Sandman comic book or seen the TV show that was based on the comic? No? You should. The author's kind of canceled now, but Neil Gaiman kind of got hella canceled. But the book is still fantastic. And if ever you, again, want another different mediums example of what we're talking about, literally look at the first chapter of that series, okay, the first issue. What you see as World War I is happening is a magician, right, because it's a fantasy world, so it's a magician, trying to commune with the dead in order to talk to his demised son, right? Like, that's how the series starts, is this guy who's trying to capture death so that he can make his son come back to life and, save him from World War I. Okay? Obviously it goes bad, and like that kicks off the whole series that lasted for many years. But again, like this sense of dread that is mixed in with a lingering mysticism and the death of old gods, all of this is kind of encapsulated in this. Does anyone have any questions so far? Yes, Francesca. Yeah.
A vibe to Lovecraft's work.
Oh, absolutely. No, for sure. What, are you pointing to this in particular? Or?
That, but especially at the Mountains of Madness, it did feel like, because I'm not familiar really with the science fiction literature. I don't know exactly at what point it began. I guess maybe with like Frankenstein, but
sure, yeah.
If you want.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was just wondering if they were in the same genres.
Yeah, a lot of people tend to put him more into the fantasy genre than the science fiction genre. just because usually when people think of science fiction, they think of human-made scientific innovations, right? That kind of lead us into some imagined future. Okay? That often goes way beyond the human, right? In unknown and vastly interesting ways. Whereas fantasy often involves, to be really reductive about it, fantasy often involves, right, these otherworldly things that intrude into our regular world, right? Much like you will see in Lovecraft. But there are some like scientific elements to it, right? Which I think is really important when we're thinking about what weird fiction is again, this kind of blurring of what science and magic is. Okay? To take a quote from a really, really okay movie, I assume everyone's seen like the first Thor movie here. Right? It was very popular, or at least you have some awareness of who Thor is, right? God of Asgard and whatever, is played by an actual god, Chris Hemsworth, who has too many abs. Right, like what that line in the first movie where he's like, well, what you call magic is just science that you don't understand, right? And it's a shockingly good line for an okay movie, but it does kind of get at what we're going to be exploring, I think, with Lovecraft and perhaps other people as well. Yeah. Any other additions? Okay. I was planned for so much. This is why I'm taking 2 classes on Lovecraft, because I plan like so many things and then just talk for too long about them. Okay. So one of the things that this class does is, of course, talk about different theories. So the first real theory that we're going to be talking about today is probably one that you've used as literary students without necessarily knowing that this was the name for it. Okay, which is to say reader response theory. Okay? Literally the response that you get from a text. Okay, so I'm going to be developing that a little bit and explain or think through why this relates to what I just spent half an hour talking about. Okay, because again, this was not just a random rambling. It's all connected. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a theory that is known as phenomenology, hence the term phenomenal worlds, right? And what we're going to be doing basically for the rest of the class is we're going to think through what phenomenology and reader response actually is, right? And how we can not only read Lovecraft's text, or what we've read so far of Lovecraft's text, through those responses or through that type of theory. And what I think is particularly interesting about At the Mountains of Madness is how the text itself and the narrator itself of that book or novella, perhaps, actually does a bit of phenomenological reading, right, and reader response reading, even though he's not necessarily reading a text in the conventional sense. Okay, so perhaps that's something that you can think about. Okay, so just based off of the term phenomenology, what do we get from that? What might that be? And I put some key thinkers up there. So if you're aware of Kant or Husserl or all of that, you might get a sense. Some of you might have seen Kant in philosophy classes that you did in college or anything like that. Does anyone want to take a shot just based off of the name phenomenology? What does that signal to us? I think that's my keyword for today is signal. Again, not a trick question. When we see a word phenomenology, what stands out? What do we think of?
It's still about the natural events happening in the world.
So say that again?
It's about events happening throughout the world.
So events happening, definitely a thing. Yeah, right? Events happening around the world, but let's push that further, right? What about those events specifically? Yes, Carlos. Yeah. I get why you would think that, and that's going to come back, but at the core of the theory, not necessarily, right? They're not necessarily unnatural. Sometimes they're extremely natural, right? A volcano erupting is a very natural occurrence. But, yes.
It's like if we take phenomenon, so maybe like
a lot of phenomenologists would say yes, but also you can apply it to something as simple as a water bottle, right? So there's nothing rare about this water bottle. They produced millions of them, and yet a phenomenological reading of this would be boring as hell, but could happen. So you mentioned so far the things themselves, right? But as the rest of that title kind of indicates, we're also interested in something else of the phenomena. It's phenomenology / reader response. So what does that tell us? We're interested not just in the actual things, right? The events that were brought up, or the rare unnatural occurrences, or even just regular occurrences, right? What we're interested in is how and why, as humans, as thinkers, as people with specific ideas and contexts, respond to them in the way that we do, right? It is, at its core, a philosophy of lived experience, okay? We were talking about trauma earlier, right? Trauma in the war. If this is a philosophy of lived experience, right, I want you to start thinking about why it would emerge right around the time when this war was happening, right? When I write down here key thinkers like Kant and Husserl is writing, it's so weird to say it in English, Husserl is technically his name, right? So Husserl is writing right as the war is ending, okay? And so again, it's something that you can kind of think through. Whoops, sorry. There we go. And of course, like reader response theory would extend from phenomenology, and in the context of literary theory, right, focus on individual readers' interpretations of a text. Okay, we're going to get into a little bit of that later, how that occurs, and how different thinkers like Rosenblatt and Stanley Fish kind of took it into different directions. But I want to spend a little bit of time first on phenomenology itself. So I have a clip here that I pulled. The title of the video is a bit misleading here for the clip. I'm not a huge fan. I'm not a fan at all of Jordan Peterson. I think he's a despicable human being. But the video is an exploration of, right, this, I think it would be an exaggeration to call him a thinker. This academic, technically, his ideology, right? And the presenter here, who actually has a degree in philosophy, is exploring the concept of phenomenology itself, right? And I think she brings up a really fun way of actually addressing this concept. So I'm just going to play like a 2-minute clip of it, and then we're going to come back.
Phenomenology. Phenomenology is famously very simple. To understand it, let's read a passage from philosopher Edmund Husserl. Immediate seeing, sehen, not merely the sensory seeing of experience, but seeing in general as primordial data consciousness of any kind whatsoever, is the ultimate source of justification for all rational statements. It has this right conferring functions and limited insofar as its object giving this place. This world is not there for me as a okay? Let's do an example. Phenomenology is all about focusing on what you experience. So check this out. So just go for a little walk around me, and you at home, keep your eyes on the couch, okay? Just experience. Did you at any point see the entire couch? No, you didn't. You can only ever see one side of it at a time. And yet, in your mind's eye, you weren't going, there is one side of a couch, there is another side of a couch. In your mind's eye, you experience it as one complete thing. And more than that, you experience it as being for something. It's a couch for sitting on. It looks comfy or ugly or whatever. Maybe it reminds you of a similar couch that you've seen. Maybe you'd like a couch like this one. Maybe you'd like to do something on a couch like this one. So your experience of it brings in bits of the past and bits of the future and desires and values. This is a very different way of looking at the world than a scientist or a computer might. Peterson actually gives a...
Yep. So then she kind of brings it back to her analysis of Jordan Peterson. But did we all catch that? In some way, obviously, she was making a bit of a joke of it at first, because it is famously complicated. But I do find the example of the sofa that she brings up really good, actually. Not necessarily for literary purposes exclusively, but also more generally about the phenomenological project. Wow, I'm actually surprised that I managed to say phenomenological in just one go without hesitating right there. Right, where not only she was focusing on the couch, right, but there were other things that popped out at us in that kind of 360 view that we got of the set, right? Suddenly, our immersion of the video was broken. Obviously, you didn't watch like the full 35-minute video, so you didn't necessarily have like a full immersion, right? But what did you see? We saw cameras, we saw microphones, we saw that the costume she was wearing was not quite complete at the back, right? There was like a weird gap to allow her neck to move, right? All of which kind of breaks down a certain illusion, right? And makes us reconsider for a moment that we're not just experiencing this person in an actual, weird white world, but an actual set. Okay? So that's kind of the point of phenomenology, and we brought it up. I brought it up at first that Kant would be one core thinker. He wouldn't call himself necessarily a phenomenologist, right? But part of his work was very much interested in making a distinction between a thing in itself, right? To come back to Plato, if we will, right? The idea of a bottle of water, what it is exactly, what it's meant to do, and the phenomenon of the bottle, which is kind of where Husserl comes in, right, with the way that the bottle presents itself to us, right? In this dim-ish lighting of the classroom, some of you might see the bottle as a little bit darker, whereas people on this side might see the streaks of light that are on it and see it in a little bit of a lighter way. You on this side might see some of the scratches that are engaged, that are on the bottle, whereas you on this side with less light might not, right? And your hand is in the way. So all of this is a very brief introduction to phenomenology, right? Again, this is not a philosophy class, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this specifically, which perhaps thankfully, because we could spend probably like a few weeks just deconstructing Husserl and whether or not we agree or disagree with us. But what's really the key factor to remember in this case is that what phenomenological theory is interested in is less the thing and more the experience of the thing, right? If you wanted to write that down as a note, right, in like a one-sentence summary, not the thing, but the experience of the thing. Okay? Where Husserl would also kind of expand on Kant is really on his emphasis of an intentional and rather internal structure of experience, right? And the bracketing off of external realities to focus on perception, right? What that means basically is Husserl's project would also, on top of understanding our own experiences as human beings, right, try to map out a way that we can focus in on how those experiences are mediated in the world, right? What makes it so that I am experiencing a tree as I am experiencing it in this moment, right? If I'm sitting in front of a tree, right? Is it the wind? Is it the colors themselves? Is it, some predetermined idea of what a tree is supposed to be, right? Is it the movie Pocahontas that is embedded into my mind, and now I can only imagine trees as elderly grandmothers, right, that speak to me with a raccoon, right? It's a terrible example that like 3 people are going to understand, but like, you get what I mean, right? There's all kinds of factors that we can bring into play, right, when we're actually engaging with the world around us. Okay, now, does anyone have any questions on this before we bring it into literature itself? Again, I wasn't planning on like spending that much time on it. This is mostly introductory. We're all good? Okay, you can no longer ask any questions about this. So where phenomenology would very much emerge as a theory post-World War I, right, or at least be concretized as we know it by Husserl or Merleau-Ponty was a famous French philosopher who would also kind of delve into this a little bit more. It would enter into the literary world post-World War II, right? So again, there's this kind of radical shift that happens in the world with World War II, right? I think a lot of people agree that there is a continuity between the First and Second World War. It's not that much of a break, but still, it is a pretty important break where our perceptions are concerned. And it is interesting that when English departments, as we know them today, right, or literature departments would emerge as we know them, that this is one of the first theories that would come with them, right? English departments, as we know them, really emerged post-World War II. In like the 1950s is kind of when places like the University of Montreal and McGill and so on would establish English literature departments or French literature departments. And reader response theory kind of came in as one of those ways of analyzing a text, along with the theory of literature that we're going to be talking about next week, which is structuralism. Okay? So people like Rosenblatt or Fish or there's another person that I'm blanking on, Wolfgang Iser, right, would be some of the forerunners of adapting phenomenology to a piece of literature. Okay? And how that works specifically, if we want to apply it to literature, and then I'm going to change slides to show you some of the questions that they asked about texts, right? But if we want to think of the applications to literature in more concrete terms, right, what reader response theory does is basically ask, how do texts, how does a text, right, create a dynamic, keyword here, dynamic, meaning or relationship with the readers, right? So you all have books in front of you. I have notes, right? How does my foreknowledge, right? How does my experience of the world influence the way that I, well, in this case, write the text, right? But in the sense that you read a text, right? Or another person might read a text, right? What medium you use for a text might have a major influence. So I think you're the only one with a physical copy. I don't see another. Francesca, you have a physical copy as well, right? The way that we read physical copies, right, is not the same way that we read digital copies of a text. Now, obviously, when reader response theory was starting, there was no such thing as digital copies of texts. In the 50s, no one was thinking of that. At best, we had photocopies, but that was complicated and weird, right? So we weren't necessarily thinking of that, but that's one way that today in the 21st century, we might think of reader response theory. And there's all kinds of other ways that we can kind of think about it. When we were looking at the Philosophy Tube clip, one of the things that was brought up is the gaps, right? What's not being seen at a certain moment, right? That's something that phenomenology is very interested in. In the original clip, you see Abigail Thorne front-wise with the front of the couch. That is a particular perspective, right? And as she mentioned, you are forced in your mind to imagine the rest of the couch because you've seen plenty of couches in your life before, so you can assume what it looks like. And then as the camera shifts, you realize, oh, the couch doesn't actually look like that from the back. It shifts your perspective. And texts do that all the time, right? On a literary perspective, authors, whether it's Lovecraft or anyone else, right, will introduce an idea, and then a few paragraphs later might throw a wrench into that idea and say, aha, you were wrong the entire time, right? Arthur Conan Doyle is a perfect example of this, right? With Sherlock Holmes, right? Blanked on that for a bit, but Sherlock Holmes is a really good example of this. Indicating certain ideas, and then at the very end revealing that you did not have the whole picture. And so as a result, you are an idiot for not solving the mystery in as quick of a way as Holmes did. Okay? So you can kind of go on and on and on, right? If we want to attribute specific ideas to specific thinkers, right? Rosenblatt herself would engage with the idea that the meaning of a text is not fixed, right? Which is something that we ascribe to people like Jacques Derrida, right? And other postmodern literary critics, but is also at the core of literary theory from the beginning, right? And that this interaction between text and reader means, by definition, that the text is not a fixed idea. Okay? Stanley Fish would elaborate on this by bringing in the idea of interpretative communities, which is pretty much exactly as it sounds, that the worlds and the communities that you are a part of, and we're all a part of a myriad communities, changes how you talk and engage with a text. When I talk to you all, you are technically a community that I am a part of, right? You are my students. When I talk to you about a text, I assume that you have certain knowledge about how to read and engage with literature because you're literature students. When I talk to my mom about literature, she reads, she's not illiterate, of course, but she's not a literary scholar. And so I don't necessarily engage with literature in the same depth and with the same passion, right? Usually the conversations that I have with my mom go something like, yeah, this book was pretty good, and I recommend it, or I don't, right? Which obviously, if I did this in this community, so to speak, I would get fired very quickly. Okay? So that's very much what this idea of interpretative communities is raising. Any questions so far before we move on? Are we already starting to see why this might matter to Lovecraft, right? Or at least the text that we're reading today? Right? We're going to take a break soon, but I encourage you to start thinking about that because I am explicitly going to put questions up on the board later that ask you to think through At the Mountains of Madness from a phenomenological or reader response mode. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that I think are important. But just to cap off this discussion on the theoretical aspect, right? Some of the key questions that emerge, right? And I'm going to be putting up some of the PowerPoint, or actually I'm going to be putting up the PowerPoint on Studium, so you don't need to rapidly try to write this all down, right? But these are things that if you are looking to engage with reader response theory a little bit more, which by the way, these are the kinds of questions that you can ask about texts, right? I did frame them in very abstract ways though, because I want you to be able to actually apply them to different texts, not just Lovecraft. So what we call transactional reader response theory, right, is pretty much what we were talking about with Rosenblatt. How does the interaction between a literary text and the reader create meaning itself, right, or a meaning with the text? How do moments of indeterminacy, right, not knowing or not saying on the part of the text, stimulate certain interpretations? Or we have things like subjective reader response, right? Where we'll read a very specific passage, right? And ask ourselves, how does this passage engage with the rest of the text and ourselves in order to influence everything else that we've read? Okay? Are there mistakes or contradictions in the text? Okay? To pull from a famous quote from Milton, right? John Milton, who I hope some of you have read Paradise Lost, but he even said, right, even Homer sleeps. And what he means by that is because Homer was speaking in an oral tradition. Sometimes there are people who write text and forget what they wrote, and it creates contradictions in the text, right? But those contradictions are really interesting to think about. Okay. Or as we were talking about with Fish, Stanley Fish, what are some of the shared cultural beliefs? And these cultural beliefs, I just gave a few examples, but you can really think of anything. I gave the examples of morality, or our ideas about children, or the purpose of literature itself, right? You can have all kinds of cultural beliefs that change over time and place. But how do these cultural beliefs actually get us to change our mind or change our perspective about literature? Right? And this last one is probably the hardest one, which is why I didn't necessarily elaborate on it, because it requires a lot more research than the other types, which is to say psychological reader response, which is basically done by more professional literary theorists, but I still wanted to mention it in case you were interested, which is the way that you can analyze someone else's interpretation, right? And see what their own gaps are. Famously, a rather famous literary critic called Harold Bloom would write about what's called the anxiety of influence, right? And so what he was interested in is a form of reader response with that, by saying, okay, well, what were some authors that I'm reading influenced by, and how did that impact their text itself? Okay? So he was interested in it from a literary perspective, but some people also look at other literary critics, right? That's pretty much that. I just want to, before we finish this part of the class, I do want to highlight something that is often associated with reader response theory, which is what I wrote here at the bottom. It is important to remember that this is not a theory where you can just say whatever you want and claim that it's your own interpretation, right? Like that's an easy way of getting out of actually putting a lot of effort into literary criticism and literary analysis. And reader response as a kind of idea has encouraged, some undergrads or some people who are less trained in it, not necessarily undergrads, to kind of just go based off of a sense that they have of the text. Right? But at the end of the day, it is important to remember that reader response theory, despite being heavily influenced by your personal ideas and cultures and communities, does necessitate a deep engagement with the text. Any questions? Okay. When we come back, we're going to be reading Lovecraft phenomenologically, right? With some guiding questions that I put up here. Okay. So take a break, come back in like 10 minutes or so. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. Okay. I will. I know that some people today, like I said, are sick, so it's fine. But we are still missing like half the class, nonetheless. So I will put it on the recording here to make sure that that was clear, right? If people do use the recordings, they're there for people who are who can't actually make it or who are sick, right? If people do start using the recordings for reasons to kind of not show up to class, which of course is none of your problems here. You're all really fine, but just in general, right? I think it's a good reminder that people should still come to class because they will miss lovely activities like the one we're about to do right now. So what do we know about Lovecraft himself, right? Like, why did I spend an hour and change on all of this? Do we know much about Lovecraft and his personal life or anything like that? I am genuinely curious what people knew about him going into this, if anything. Nothing? Okay.
Yes, he writes about Gaussian novels, horror,
Yeah.
scary.
So, scary writer. That is absolutely true, right? Good. What else? Nothing? Francesca? Yep, that is absolutely true, right? But again, so this is something that's brought up in the introduction to the edition that you have in the bookstore, right? That's part of the reason why I assigned the text that we are reading today, right? It's probably the text that Lovecraft wrote that is both good and least coated with horrendous racist stuff, right? There's a reason why, a lot of the monsters that he describes, right, are extremely racially coded in a lot of his stories, right? Is because he himself was, pretty racist with everyone that wasn't British, white British, I should say. So it is an interesting thing to mention, right? Not just because it does, in this case, actually inform the type of stories that he wrote, right? But also gets at a little bit of what we were talking about before the break, right? He tended to think of the world in these kinds of absolutes, right? That went beyond definable categories. And that can sometimes extend into things like race, especially at the time that Lovecraft was writing, right? In the early 20th century. And of course, today we find it rather despicable, right? To put it lightly, although racism is obviously still a thing, right? But to put it in the terms that that Lovecraft would have perhaps engaged with, right? The way that he was engaging with racism was rather phenomenological in that sense, right? He was imagining a lot of othered people, or what today we would call other people. So basically, again, from his perspective, non-white, non-British, or non-American people, as these otherworldly beings that could harm him, right? And of course, that's wrong, right? But it is rather insightful to think about Lovecraft, the author, and how that view of the world would have perhaps inflected some of the writing that he had, right? Although weirdly enough, he was anti-Semitic and yet married a Jew. It was a very weird thing on his part to use that term in a different context. But yeah, a very, very bizarre person. But what's also kind of interesting about him is that he was a very isolated person, right? And that, almost certainly contributed to his view of the world, right? But isolated in the actual literal physical sense of the term isolated. From a very young age, he lived a rather reclusive life with his mother, right? I don't think his father was in the picture, if I remember correctly. So he lived a very, socially isolated life. He was a very sickly child, right? And so he did very much rely on imagining these other worlds because often he actually didn't engage with the world around him, right? Which is a very interesting perspective for the 20th century, right? Where, as we brought up a little bit last week, you simultaneously have an increasing access to the world through newspapers, media, Radio is starting to be a thing in the 20th century where it wasn't really in the 19th. And yet there are still pockets of the world, like Lovecraft's family, which were totally cut off in many ways, right? And that kind of forced, at least from his perspective, it seemed to have forced him to imagine anything outside his very contained bubble of a family, right, to be monstrous in many ways, which can create some really awesome, in the literal sense of the term, stories, but also be very dangerous when it comes to things like racism or sexism, right? Which, of course, he also was, because it's the early 20th century, and why not add that as well to the list of things that you are? But making jokes of it aside, I think it is interesting to find parallels between Lovecraft, the person, and the type of stories that he was writing. And that's kind of, I think, one of the things that we need to consider when we're reading someone like Lovecraft, or just any text phenomenologically, right? Or with a reader response lens, is that the author's personal life can have a way of creeping into the text and informing it, right? That was the last question that we brought up, or one of the last questions that we brought up, right? What are the experiences of different authors, including the author of the text itself, right? How might that have actually inflected the story that we're reading? I don't think it's at play as much in At the Mountains of Madness specifically, but definitely in other texts. And there are certain things, of course, that we can make out in At the Mountains of Madness that show what Lovecraft would have been aware of, right? So, for example, one of the things that I think would be worthy to talk about are some of the artists that he references, right? Did anyone catch that, right? I see some of you nodding yes, good. So obviously the major one is Poe, right? Poe, who we've talked about last week, he mentions. But also he mentions two painters by name, right? And uses them as descriptors, or as a way for readers to imagine what the narrator himself is actually seeing in the text. And we're going to be talking a little bit about this later, but this is something that we can think about from a reader response perspective, right? What does the author actually know, right? So we know that Lovecraft clearly would have been aware of the painters that he's referencing. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to reference them with such detail. But what's interesting by that is that he expects his readers to actually know who they are as well, right? Because remember, he's writing at a time long, long, long before the internet, which is obviously stating the obvious, right? The internet only appeared in the last 30 years or so. But it is demonstrative of what Lovecraft, the man, thought his audience knew, right? And so what we see in things like this is a bit of a double-edged sword, where he is simultaneously isolated and trying to extend himself out into the world and thinking about what other people are like in deeply psychological ways at the end of the day, right? Okay, what did we think of Lovecraft? Just general thoughts so far. Yes, no, he was okay, but I will never read him again type of thing. What are we thinking? Just general ideas to start us off, and then I'm gonna let you think about the questions that I put up on the board. No one? We're just totally inconvenienced by him? Yeah. Remind me what your name is? Milezi, yes. Okay.
No competition and scientific language. I mean, kind of maybe later in my life I will read again.
So complicated, mostly because of the scientific descriptions, long descriptions especially, right? And it kind of meanders. You're not kind of sure where it goes exactly. Yeah, okay, good. Hold on to that thought. I think you should stay with that, okay? We'll talk about it a little bit later. Francesca, you also had your hand up. Yeah.
Descriptions were so detailed and specific that even at that, I was still confused because the descriptions were just so long and endless. Uh-huh. And it felt very repetitive throughout the text. So it just felt like I was lost, even though I was understanding the text, overall confusing.
The repetitive part, I think I agree. To come back to what I said last week, I think that's a feature rather than a bug. And I think that'll fit more with our discussion next week. right? When we talk about structuralism, but I think you're onto something rather good there. Okay, but yes, I'll say yes, but to that. Okay. Did anyone not like? Oh, yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
I second on that. Oh, like the text, the book itself was interesting.
Yeah.
I just felt like everything was long and drawn out. So while reading, I just kept getting lost in the text.
Good. Okay.
But
Good.
I tried to like it because I thought the overall contents were interesting. But of course, yeah, it was like very descriptive.
Okay. Yeah. So very descriptive, meandering. Okay. Does that ruin the text for you, or can you still appreciate it despite it being long and meandering? Anyone can answer this, by the way, but go ahead.
It doesn't ruin it, but I feel like it's like I tried to read the whole book before class.
Yeah.
It felt like I had a deadline and I couldn't like really get to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never. Yeah, I should mention this. Especially with texts that we're covering for 2 weeks, this is especially true with Kraken later. Don't feel like you need to cram the entire thing. Like, I assume that you're not going to have time to finish everything. This is not the only class that you're taking, a lot of you, so like, I'll just assume that. Okay. Take a load off your back, but okay, good. So the cramming aspect of it or rushing it kind of.
But I feel like if I had more time to read it, I could have like enjoyed it better.
Okay, maybe a second reread will help. Good. Did you have your hand up, Francesca?
Yeah, well, I feel like the repetitiveness, vagueness, and intense details might be just a feature of the Gothic. Just to create the atmosphere of uneasiness and all that.
You contradicted yourself in this case. Yeah, vagueness and hyper detailed.
It's because
how does that?
Like there's like so many details that you can't even picture it. It's like it's so detailed that it's vague. Maybe to some people that would be a contradiction, but to me it makes sense.
Do you think that's intentional on Lovecraft's part?
I think so.
Good. Maybe think about that. Maybe that's an essay topic. It's fine if you take these ideas, by the way, for essays. I'm not just saying that. Just like, but all of these are really good. And something else I'll pick up on is the mention of the Gothic here. So last week I ended the class with saying, by asking, right, are these texts by Poe and Gilman weird fiction? And a lot of you seem to kind of come down on the side of yes, right? And yet I wouldn't necessarily call Lovecraft Gothic, right? So I'm not going to ask the question now, but are we starting to see already differences between what Lovecraft is writing, right, as a style versus what Gilman and Poe were writing, right? And I think that's something that you should stay with a little bit as well, right? Because I do definitely agree that there are some Gothic elements to Lovecraft, but I wouldn't qualify it as a Gothic genre or a Gothic text. And I think those distinctions are what really bring us into a weird fiction realm, right? So this is something that I'll bring up again next week, and that you should definitely think about if you finish reading or if you read the text a second time, right? Okay, what I would like to do is give you a few minutes, right? Because none of you have seen these questions before, so I'm not expecting you to actually have answers to them specifically. I want you to take a few minutes and actually read through these questions and find passages that will help us develop. I'm going to leave them up here, so if you want to take pictures of them, that's fine, but you won't have to. And actually think through these questions. You can do it in groups, right? You can do it alone, do whatever you want, right? When I've done this in the past with students, albeit at a different level, I usually start with like 15 or 20 minutes, right? But if you want to take more time after, right, if we're not finished or anything like that, it's totally okay. We'll take the time it needs, okay? There's no rush. The point here is to look through these. And in case you didn't notice, these questions are basically adaptations of the reader response ideas that we brought up in the first half of class, okay? But applied to the specific context of At the Mountains of Madness. So things like, how do Lovecraft's descriptions, which we've already brought up, evoke a sense of lived experience, right? How does the use of the ineffable, do we all know what ineffable means? When I say ineffable? No. Okay. Ineffable basically means something that's undescribable is ineffable. Right. So how does the use of the quote unquote undescribable emphasize the alien or incomprehensible aspects? Right, so that's one question that you can think of. How do you, and by you I mean as readers, right, not just enjoyers of literature, but active readers, co-create meanings? So that's a pretty standard question in reader response. So maybe you can look at one of the passages and think about how you come into the making of that meaning. Okay. If ever you're wondering, personally, I think the passages where they have journal sections or responses from like radio responses and all of that, which happen a few times in the text, is a good place to start. Okay. I think that's a really good example of how Lovecraft expects us to also fill in a bit of gaps. In what way is the narrator a reader? Right. Obviously, there's the surface level reading, right? Actually engaging with the text. But I think you're all astute enough to realize that we can read more than a simple text, right? And as we were bringing up in the first part of class, we can read the world around us, right? So in what way does the narrator actually reflect that type of reading experience? What does it do? I said references to other artists, but what exactly does it mean to, or what does it add to the text that he references the other artists? So for those of you who are wondering, the picture that I have here is one of the paintings that he references, right? So do we all get to the section where he mentioned Rorich's Asian paintings, right? It was very vague in the way that he said it, but that's what he's referring to. Rorich was a Russian painter who painted things like the Tibetan landscape, which is what's represented right here. So when Poe's referencing Rorich, he's referencing these types of paintings. Okay. And the last question, this might be, I put this here, but I think that's more towards the end of the text that this reappears, so I don't know if we're all necessarily going to be able to answer it. But in what way does Lovecraft make science mirror what we expect of religion? Right? I think this really comes up at the end of the text again, but you can start thinking through that even if you haven't finished it. Okay. So like I said, take a few minutes. I have my own passages already out and ready to go, but I'm curious like what you find and what this makes. So again, if you want to kind of go at it in teams or individually, that's entirely up to you. Okay? And of course, don't hesitate if you have any questions. There we go. Okay, so like I said, I have a few passages that I identified that we can use to kick us off. But something that I want to highlight, which I think is kind of interesting as you kind of gather your thoughts, because I will ask you to actually answer these questions first before I jump in. In the introduction to the edition that I had you buy, I do think that it's interesting that it points out what I think is a very astute observation, right? And this is 2 pages into the introduction if people want to follow along, but there's just a paragraph that says, Mountains at the Mountains of Madness makes it uniquely plain that Lovecraft's interest in the weird subordinates the bagatelles of simple events, quote unquote. In narrative terms, the story is astonishingly straightforward, and such revelations as it contains are telegraphed fairly clearly. In place of narrative intricacies, we are treated to an astonishing several-page description of the old ones that are dug up from under the ice, creatures which mock the Linnaean schema and preconceptions of history. In this obsessive act of description, Lovecraft deploys the childish passion for making up monsters that depict a scientific methodology presiding over the collapse of its own predicates. And then you go on to elaborate a little bit. But I think the key part of that introduction here is that the story is not really what matters here, right? In a lot of literature, and fair enough, I think there's a lot of literature that has some really good plots to it, right? Like the story is what grabs you. I gave the example earlier of mystery fiction, right? Usually when people read a mystery, it's because they're interested in the actual story itself. You'll often notice that characters in mystery fiction don't necessarily play as big of a role, right? Whereas this is kind of the opposite. Plot kind of goes into the margins for Lovecraft. And I think this gets at what some of you were bringing up earlier about the description part of it, right? What in the introduction they call taxonomy as horror. And I think that we can think about that a little bit further with some of these questions. Okay. So I'm curious what you all highlighted or thought through. And it's okay if you didn't necessarily go through every single one of these questions. As I mentioned in the title, right, they're guiding questions more than anything else. So if you want to talk about something else, that's totally fine, as long as we're clear. So let's start there, right, with the descriptions themselves. So if the plot is not what matters, if the narrative itself is not what matters, but rather the descriptions themselves, how are they actually utilized, right? In what way does he use description in a way that actually makes the story interesting and engaging, right? Say more about this. And are there particular passages that are worthy of highlighting for that particular purpose? And I will sit here silently until someone answers. Do not hesitate. I'm sure all your passages that you found are beautiful, by the way. So what are some descriptions that jumped out at you that really highlight what Lovecraft is doing in this story, if we can call it a story? Yes.
Maybe I don't know, like for me it was a bad extremely blood, and since it's like he says the effectless self-referentiality of Northern architecture known to man or to human imagination, so we just like to help us really understand what it looked like. Use like a whole paragraph, just like the arch.
In the specific passage that you read, it's unlike anything known to man, right? Why does he do that? Because obviously he can describe things. He has the word capacity to do it. So why there in that moment does he kind of falter and choose not to describe it? Right? This is a question that I've asked before. Yes, Francesca. Absolutely. Gaps. Right? We were bringing that up before. Right? What are your gaps versus Lovecraft's gaps versus the narrator's gaps? Okay. So when he's saying, the thing was indescribable, or it's unlike anything known to man. Technically, what is being said here is the narrator doesn't know how to describe it in anything known to man. Okay, but you might imagine it in some particular way, and so the overlap of reader and narrator is very good here. Okay, Lovecraft himself, we don't know in this specific passage. Right? Maybe he has some idea in mind as to what it is. Actually, we kind of do, but he's not necessarily expressing it in that scenario. But we do know the narrator and the reader. Okay, very good. Anyone else want to highlight a passage? Yeah.
The Euro part, there's some message sent by Rick virus.
Yep.
Here I feel very interesting because it gives some feeling. I can feel more vividly what situation the Rick was at the site.
Yep.
Here, the director, instead of describing himself, he used the message by sent Rick. I think this function is more helping more vivid and lively experience about it, and makes the plot is more.
Absolutely. So for those of you who didn't hear, perhaps in the back, you have a very low voice. It's fine. Right, this kind of fits in with what we were saying earlier in the way that the narrator is the reader, right? This kind of fits in with the other question. What was brought up just now is the reports, right? And the way that the narrator gets, at least at first, in the earlier parts, right, reports from other people and is forced to come up with their own gap-filling methods, okay? Because, right, the people who are actually sending these reports have their own perspective, right? They choose to highlight certain elements of what they're discovering, certain truths, right? And yet the narrator has to be like, okay, well, that's interesting, but what else? I want to know about this. What about that? And then as a reader, you yourself, which side do you fall on? Do you fall on the side of the reports? Do you fall on the side of the narrator? A bit of both? Something else entirely? Right? These passages, I think you're absolutely right, are brilliant in a narrative sense because you're forced to constantly question what exactly you're being faced with. Right? Good. Excellent. To read a specific passage that I think is really good. This is in the second part for those of you who are following along. Part 2, almost at the end of part 2 for me. I have a digital copy of the exact same version, so the page numbers might be a little bit off here, but it's part 2. Where this is the one that starts at 10:15 p.m. for those of you, the report that starts 10:15 p.m. So more towards the end, but yeah. Important discovery. Orendorff and Watkins, working underground at 9:45 with light, found monstrous barrel-shaped fossil of wholly unknown nature. Probably vegetable, unless overgrown specimen of unknown marine status, radiata. Tissue evidently preserved by mineral salts, tough as leather, but astonishing flexibility retained in places. Marks of broken off parts at ends and around sides, 6 feet end to end, 3 feet 3 feet central diameter, tapering to 1 foot at each end, like a barrel with 5 bulging ridges in place of staves. And I'll just skip towards the end, or halfway through. Arrangement reminds one of certain monsters of primal myth, especially fabled elder things in Necronomicon. These wings seem to be membranous, stretched on framework of glandular tubing, apparent minute orifices in frame tubing at wing tips. And then at the end, they're talking about the dogs. Additional scarred bones found, but these must wait. Having trouble with dogs, they can't endure the new specimen and would probably tear it to pieces if we didn't keep it at a distance from them. Okay, what do we make of something like this based off of what was just said? What do we know? What are the gaps that we need to fill? Technically, it is a rather thorough description, and yet there are still some gaps here. What are some of the gaps? What do we need to fill in? What do we get from this? And gaps can be evident, by the way, even when there is a word spoken, right? Or a word written. The word can imply a gap, perhaps. What jumped out at you from this passage, if anything? Let's start there. I've rarely seen people so intently stare at a book or a screen to avoid eye contact. Yes, Alice.
A sentence where he used the word unknown like 2 times.
Yeah.
So like, even the person that's explaining what they have,
yeah,
they couldn't like really find the words to describe it.
Absolutely, right? So there is an acknowledgement that there is a lack of knowledge here, and yet what's the contradiction to that in that very same paragraph? They also reference something else. Yeah, good.
Also, Lovecraft.
Yeah. Yeah. For people who don't know, the Necronomicon is not an actual book, right? It doesn't exist in real life, unfortunately. So he's kind of being a bit meta in this case by referencing something that he himself created. Right, so we're simultaneously in one paragraph, a long paragraph that's only a few sentences at the end of the day, but faced with an acknowledgement that we don't know something, and yet relying on a text as if it were fact and as if we were citing from it, right? And so there's this inherent contradiction, like one or two sentences apart, between fact and hypothesis, right? Or fact and fiction, fact and unknown, right? Which I think is at the heart of a lot of Lovecraft's fiction, but this text in particular. Does that make sense to people? Yeah? Okay. Any other passages that we want to... Yeah, go ahead.
Narrator went to go check out Lake's camp.
Yeah.
And like found mangled bodies and everything that was like not thousand.
This is more towards the end, yeah? Is it? Oh, yes. Sorry, I was thinking of something else. Yes. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are missing bodies and
Read the passage. Yeah, go for it.
I listened that somewhere in something from the most curious cold-blooded inhuman fashion. It's the same with dogs and all the healthier, fatter bodies, bipedal or bipedal, had their most solid masses of tissue cut out and removed as by a careful butcher, and around them was a taking from the ravaged conjured up the most horrible associations.
What are the most horrible associations that are conjured up? Do we know? So this is right at the start of part 4 for people who haven't found it yet. They say here, yeah, all the healthier, fatter bodies, quadrupel and bipedal, had their most solid masses of tissue cut out and removed, as by a careful butcher, and around them was a strange sprinkling of salt taken from the ravaged provision chests on the plains, which conjured up the most horrible associations. So we get, obviously in this case, a literal removal, right? A literal gap in the bodies, which is obviously visceral and horrifying. So we have like that surface level gap, but then there's the more implied gap, right? The most horrible associations. Do we know what that is? It's a genuine question. Does the text tell us what those associations are? It's a yes or no question in this case. No. And there's the actual gap in the text, right? Here's where the reader comes in again, right? And so it's a very good passage that you brought up. Min-hee, yeah? Okay, good. It's a very good passage. So right in the level of the text, right, what Lovecraft is pointing to is that the material world that he's describing, the bodies that have been destroyed in this case, also reflect, right, a desire by humans. Desire is perhaps not desire in the term of like romantic desire, of course, but a want by humans to fill in those gaps that are left behind in the material world by making associations with something that is more in line with what we're thinking, right? And so what the text is doing here on a fundamental level is saying, you, the reader, needs to fill in those gaps. What does this make you think of, right? What are the associations that come to your mind when you imagine a mangled body, right? For example, for me, it conjures up images of a lion, right? Or a tiger, some kind of animal that would have attacked someone else, right? Of course, the reality is much worse than this because the reality is like we're dealing with even greater monsters than a tiger ever could deal with. But the notion, right, is there nonetheless. The text is asking you explicitly in these moments, or rather implicitly, I should say, to think, make your own associations, right? Fill in those gaps that were left in the bodies. Right? Be a detective for a second and try to imagine your own horror here. And then later I will reveal what the horror actually is, right? We're all good with that? I don't know if we're good with it, but it all makes sense? Okay. Okay, let's move on to the next one. We kind of touched upon like readers co-creating meanings already, right? Filling in the narrative gaps. But is there anything that we can say? Let's move on to the third question here. In what way is the narrator a reader, right? So are there passages where the narrator themselves, or himself actually, because we know it's a person, it's a guy, in what way is the narrator interpreting the world around him, right? Or offering some kind of reading response, hint, hint, that might fit in with today's lesson? How does the narrator read the world or read the texts in interesting ways that make them a reader?
I don't know exact page on the book, but most of the time the writer analyzed the mirrors or carvings made by some known creatures.
Yeah.
And he analyzed and write what the meaning is and what the intention of culture. In this case, I think he is very similar to the readers who read the text of master. And also, this for him, maybe the elder ones is the author to him, just like the author is.
Yeah, that's really excellent. So again, for those of you who might not have heard, right, this is more, again, it depends on where you are at in the text, but the example that was just given is the idea that when we enter into the city, we being the readers along with the narrator enter into this supposed city, right? What happens? The narrator starts to interpret what's on the walls, right? Or what's actually there, right? Which again, you should, if you haven't finished it, you should, so that you can get this. But let's see, I have an example that I wanted to pull up here, a specific example. Okay, yeah. Corona Mundi, roof of the world. All sorts of fantastic phrases sprang from our lips. This is at the beginning of part 5, by the way. All sorts of fantastic phrases sprang from our lips as we looked dizzily around the unbelievable spectacle. I thought again of the eldritch primal myths that had so persistently haunted me since my first sight of this dead Antarctic world, of the demoniac, hint hint as to earlier in this class, right? Demoniac. Plateau of Leng or the Migo, or abominable snowmen of the Himalayas, of the narcotic manuscripts of the pre-human implications of the Cthulhu cult of the Necronomicon, and of the Hyperborean legends of formless Sarthagua, and the worse than formless star spawn associated with that semi-entity. I realize now that as we read Lovecraft out loud, you sound like you're having a stroke sometimes, which I apologize for anyone that might have been the case. But right, what he's getting at here, he's doing kind of something similar to what we're doing with reader response, right? He's making associations, right? Seeing something and saying, okay, what this does is remind me of something else, right? And I'm reading that world or this Antarctic wasteland, quote unquote wasteland, through the lens of my already knowledge, right? This was brought up with the Necronomicon before, and Necronomicon comes up again, but the actual this passage also brings up other references, sometimes to real things, sometimes to completely fabricated myths and legends, right? But even if they're fabricated myths and legends, that doesn't stop it from being important to our reading of the text, right? We're still making associations with other things, other beings, other ideas, right? Other interpretative communities, perhaps, right? Other beings than ourselves, okay? That allow us to inform what we see. Anything else? How else is the narrator a reader? Yeah.
The black thing.
Yeah. Okay, we're going far. Spoilers for those of you who haven't gotten to part 11. Yeah, go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So say more about that. Why is the odor matter and all of that? Like or maybe someone else who knows, like, let's push this further. There is a sense, right? Like let's hang on to the odor part, right? If we want to take a pure phenomenological notion here, we're experiencing something before it actually shows up in our eyes, right? And again, the mind in the context of the story is meant to fill in the gaps that are literally left in the physical space, right? It's impossible to imagine, right, something like the creature that's actually going to be seen, but another one of our senses kind of takes over with the odor, right? And you're meant to make free associations. Right? Oh my God, it smells like absolute, doggerel in here. something bad must happen, right? So I think, yeah, very good. We're going to come back to like the second half a little bit later, but yeah, that's an excellent part. I think, this question, surprise, surprise, I kind of meant the questions to fold into one another in one way or another. But I think we can connect the question of in what way is the reader a narrator to the references to other artists. How might they be connected, right? So there are references. How do the artists that are referenced, like Roerich, Smith, Poe, meant to get us to imagine the narrator as a kind of reader? Yeah.
It's not a fully formed out thought.
Yeah, no, please.
When he talks about Roerich's painting,
Yeah.
It's like the one on the screen.
Yeah.
He always before mentioning the painting, he's like a bit strange and disturbing, or he adds another, or like haunting, I think at one point. And when I look at the paintings, I don't see that at all. So it always marks me as strange that he would characterize that as that, which the other ones kind of make sense, like the Italy, Babel, Plateau.
Yeah.
Like those kind of make sense, but for that one specifically, I find it strange that he refers to it as a haunting.
Yeah.
I feel like he's trying to convince the reader that it's haunting, maybe, or something, but...
Because what Roerich is painting here is an actual, well, I don't know if it's still around, because Roerich would have been painting around, like, the time that Lovecraft was writing, right? So he was a relative contemporary to Lovecraft, but, this is just a village that existed in Tibet, right, presumably, or some version of it. And so let's answer that question. What is bizarre about this, if anything? Why would the narrator find this bizarre? Because I think there's a reason why he brings it up in the context of the text. But you're right, there is a bit of a discrepancy there where he makes a comment on the painting and then as a way to comment on the world that he's experiencing, right? So let's start there. Is there anything bizarre about this painting? Liam, you say no.
Mountain is much higher than Everest.
Right.
One of the highest mountain.
Good. The mountains. Yeah.
Climate is unusual. The writer describes is very cold.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of wind blast.
Yeah. So the context almost of the painting is more bizarre than the painting itself, right? Like the mountains are towering higher than most mountains would in real life, right? Like there are obviously huge mountains in the world. But the way that it's framed, they seem to be really imposing over the village, right? And of course, when you see something like this, like the Tibetan landscape, you immediately understand that it's meant to be brutally cold there, right? And no one likes that. Or, I mean, some people like it, clearly, because there's some people who live there. But, right, generally, people have a more negative reaction towards blistering cold. Right? So there's a bit of bizarreness there. I would say maybe the colors also might add a little bit to the bizarreness of them. It's not quite natural, right? Like nothing actually looks like this in the real world. When you see snow in real life, it doesn't quite look like that. Right? Or at least it's more shiny, perhaps, in real life. The actual houses, they have a slight distortion to them. The actual, like if you look at the top one, right, it's a bit curved, right, rather than fully straight. Kind of adds a little bit of bizarreness to it. So there is something there, but I think you're right. Like by and large, it's not out of the ordinary. It is technically a normal place. So why use it to talk about what is being seen in the story, right? Why does it matter to the story? Because it does. Lovecraft, for all his faults, was a professional writer. He didn't just do things because he felt like it. So why include this in the story as a way of making a normal place strange? I'll ask the question a different way. Throughout the story, he defines the Antarctic, where the story takes place, with a very specific adjective. What is it? Do we know? Do we remember? The adjective that's used quite often is dead, right? Dead or nothing living there, right? Or things like that. And yet, associating something like a painting to it, what does that do to a supposedly dead land? Right? It makes it live, right? It adds a quality to it, an aesthetic sense to it that by its very definition should not be, right? obviously we can disagree personally with that idea of the Antarctic, right? I think personally, if you look at images of a frozen landscape, it can be very aesthetically pleasing, right? But in the context of the story, at least, the narrator doesn't think so. Right? The narrator often associates the landscape itself with dead and barren and hostile, right? And yet to have something like this implies life, right, in some way, shape, or form, which clashes. I mean, he does acknowledge penguins also in the story, but he acknowledged, for some, maybe someone can answer me on this. Why he hates penguins so much is beyond me, right? Did everyone catch that? There's a few moments where he describes penguins as like uber monstrous and as if they were the most grotesque animal possible. And I don't understand why. Maybe someone can offer an answer here. I didn't find one that was satisfactory, aside from just an ingrained hatred for penguins that has no justification in reality. Did everyone notice that? No? Okay, well, some people did. Anyway, out of curiosity, did anyone ever look up Smith, Nicholas Smith, and his work? No? Sorry, not Nicholas Smith, Clark Ashton Smith. This is another one. This is another passage that I think fits in with not only the references to other artists, but starts to get us towards the religion aspect. And then I see that you're all starting to get tired, so we'll leave after. Right, where he mentions complete specimens. This is, sorry, I should mention, this is right at the start. Or not right at the start, but it's still in part 1, I think. But he mentions, whoops, I had it. Yeah, it's the page after the one I read earlier on 10:15 p.m., so it's the page after that. Complete specimens have such uncanny resemblance to certain creatures of primal myth that suggestion of ancient existence outside Antarctic becomes inevitable. Dyer and Pabodie have read Necronomicon and seen Clark Ashton Smith's nightmare paintings based on the text, and will understand when I speak of elder things supposed to have created all earth life as a jest or a mistake. So for those of you who are curious about Clark Ashton Smith, I forgot to bring it up. This is what his work looks like. Yeah, weird stuff. Like, that's the face that you're supposed to have, is like what you're all feeling right now is like, why does this exist? Right? This one's my favorite. Just this derpy looking fella. But there's some that are like truly terrifying, right? Like, what is this? What is being painted here? I don't know. But there are tentacles in it. We'll say that at least about it. That makes it kind of bizarre. Like all kinds of sketches, like this pine cone of death or whatever that exists here. So that's what he's referencing here. Okay? Does anything on Earth look like this? Right? No. Okay? So what are we seeing here, again, to reemphasize this point, is Lovecraft relying on art and, by definition, the imagination to try to describe the intrusion of something that should not be on Earth, right? There is kind of an aesthetic statement being made here in many interesting ways where the imagination kind of goes beyond our own comprehension of it, right? Or the imagination kind of extends beyond itself, despite being a very human quality. Or, I think some animals have demonstrated, imagination. I think chimpanzees have also painted and elephants have painted, but like it's a relatively self-contained thing, right? And yet what he seems to be getting at is that the imagination also relies on needing to go beyond itself in order to understand what we cannot possibly experience in a concrete and material world, right? In short, the material world has its own limitations, right? And the imagination, and to come to our last question here, religion also has its own benefits, right? And this passage that I read also kind of comes to the religious aspect, right? Ancient existence outside of the Antarctic becomes inevitable. Technically speaking, what is this story? It is a scientific expedition in the Arctic, right? The narrator is what? What's his profession? He mentions it at some point. A geologist. Good. What's a geologist? What does a geologist do in life? Yeah, yeah, basically the study of rocks, right, and minerals, right? It's a science, right? And yet, what are we seeing in this story is that science itself, right, is uncovering something way beyond the ideas of science, right? Which brings us back to that, Thor quote at the beginning, right? Magic is just something that science does not understand yet, right? And that seems to be kind of what Lovecraft is going for, at least in the first, in some parts of this text, right? Science is wonderful in many ways, right? Truly spectacular. The things that we are able to know about the world around us, is truly astounding, thanks to the work of generations of scientists, right? And yet, what science also kind of does is claim, in many ways, to offer answers to a lot of things in the world, right? Answers that, for people like Lovecraft, at the very least, you can obviously agree or disagree. I know I disagree in some respects, right? Right? Says sometimes there are no answers to some things, right? Or sometimes we can't just rely on the language of science, right? So maybe there is an answer, but it's not to be found in geology, right? It's not to be found in a theoretical textbook, right? It's to be found in the imagination, perhaps, right? Relying on the painters. It's to be found in, for some people, faith, right? It's to be found in literature. Okay? I think that's all I had for today. Does anyone want to say any final words on this? Okay, I'll ask this. For those of you who mentioned the descriptions as being too much, perhaps, has this started to kind of change your mind about why they were there? Or are you starting to see that they have their uses to the story, or are you still ambivalent about them? It's fine if you still are. I'm just curious generally. Francesca, you're nodding. Is that a yes? What does that yes mean? Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Again, next week we're going to be talking about structuralism, right, as a mode of reading, and I think this is where we'll really be able to get into the text itself, right? Because today, I admit, right, we were talking about feelings more than anything else, sentiments that were gained from the text, which is in part what reader response theory does. But next week we're going to go full literature on it and really examine the words. Okay, so that's your homework for next week, right, is to actually finish At the Mountains of Madness if you have not, or maybe give it a secondary reading if you have. And I want you to think specifically of the text on a linguistic level and on a structural level, right? And when I mean structural level, I mean both on the level of the entire story, right? Beginning, middle, and end. What are the myths that they're referencing and so on? But also maybe on a sentence level. Right? The structure of a sentence can also impact how we read a text. Okay? So think about that. If anyone is interested in more reader response theory, either for the essay at the end of class, at the end of the semester, or anything like that, just general knowledge, for every class that we talk about a new theory, I will be offering some suggested readings to get into those ideas. So that'll be on the PowerPoint that is going to be online soon. Okay, so just go through that. These are some of the people that I referenced today. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate. But if not, enjoy your weekend, and I will see you next week.